Thank you for joining me for another Dicker Data Training Academy. My name is Robert Crane, and details about myself can be found on the screen at the moment. So please note that the webinar has started. We are recording. As usual, please direct all questions to microsoft.sales@dickerdata.com.au. Certainly try to answer any that are mentioned in the chat, but we may not have time to do that. So the best option to get your questions answered is to go to send an email to microsoft.sales@dickerdata.com.au. So our weekly webinars continue on. Today we'll have a look at Troubleshooting Office 365, and next week, for the last one in October, we'll look at creating just a very basic LAN in Azure to give you some idea of how to go about and make that happen. So our agenda for today on Office 365 troubleshooting, we'll look at some bandwidth considerations, troubleshooting the identity, Exchange, SharePoint, Skype for Business, and our best practices and takeaways. So let's kick off our discussion on troubleshooting around bandwidth. The obvious thing to note is that all cloud deployments, no matter what they are, Office 365 and the like, have become heavily dependent on bandwidth. This means that in many cases, this can be a source of problems, choke point, all the sort of challenges that you focus now, especially if clients are accessing lots and lots of information outside their organization. They're typically going to need a far more robust and typically much faster bandwidth than what they may have been using with their on-premise environment. So again, the first thing in any environment is to make sure that the bandwidth is adequate, and secondly, obviously can scale to accept the amount of load that we will expect to see. Always a good benchmark to go and run something like speedtest.net or the equivalent. I would suggest that you do that on a regular basis. People's broadband connections can change, can be reconfigured. So part of the regular maintenance perhaps is to make sure that you do a regular survey of the actual bandwidth that clients are getting. So typically with something like ADSL2, it can vary quite markedly. So in theory, you could get up to 24 meg down and maybe up to a meg back up, but I have seen situations where that is far worse than that optimal level. So make sure that you do take a speed test, or you get some sort of benchmark to know what the usage or what the actual line is, and obviously make sure that that matches up with what the client is paying for. Again, this should go without saying that we're moving to an environment where we need, where dependency or the customer's dependency on bandwidth is much greater. This means that you need to look at deploying a business grade synchronous DSL line where possible. So synchronous gives us the same speed up to the internet as down to the internet. So if you are specifically working with clients who have a heavy dependency on documents, looking to download documents, update documents, work especially with something like SharePoint or OneDrive Online, ADSL basically probably is going to struggle, just simply given its limitation of upspeed. So it's important to understand and speak to the client so that they appreciate that. Again, the A in ADSL stands for asymmetric, which means obviously different downspeed to upspeed, and the more they require to upload and work with documents in the cloud, the greater the requirement to have symmetric connections. Now, the reason you want to go to a business grade, obviously we get less contention, we also get better support. In general, it's a much better option. So if your clients generally are moving to cloud, one of the main things, their consideration initially is generally around cost, but it's important to understand that the dependency on the broadband means that and some part of the savings made by moving equipment into the cloud needs to be basically redeployed into a better internet connection. So again, you're looking for business grade connection. Now that may not always be possible, we certainly understand that, but again, it's something that should be revisited on a regular basis, because obviously plans change, and also rollout of things like NBN also change over time. So make sure that part of your planning process with customers who go Office 365 is to review and possibly update their broadband connection on a regular basis. Again, as clients generally start off perhaps just using email in Office 365, they then grow to understand and appreciate the benefits that something like OneDrive or SharePoint can provide, they would then be looking to increase their usage. So if they move from pure emails to files and folders, obviously that's going to create much more contention on the line, and therefore they need to look at upgrading their bandwidth. So make sure that you not only speak to them about their current broadband requirements, but also put in place a plan to allow that to be upgraded in the future, because generally the dependency on the cloud, the usage of the cloud is only going to increase. So this is going to mean generally basically more and more usage is required for the broadband connection. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, if there's a heavy reliance for file usage, then basically you need to have some sort of allowance to compensate for that. So again, a rule of thumb is probably around 0.5 meg per user in both directions. So you can see that it doesn't take much to get up to something like 5 meg up, as well as 5 meg down. So remember that once you become heavily reliant on cloud-based files, that's certainly going to create a significant load or significant contention on the broadband connection. And again, ADSL typically only has a very, very limited upload bandwidth to the internet, and this is why it's better to broach these subjects and solve these issues initially when the point of installation is occurring. Now, again, probably a good idea is if you do have issues around bandwidth or contention or slow files or something to do with the ISP, you should be able to easily compare that to an alternate broadband connection. So maybe you can test the uploading of files from your office or from a similar office, or maybe get the users to test the same sort of connection at home, see if they're getting the same sort of issues if they are experiencing performance problems. So again, don't forget that there are a lot of points in between the client and the service these days. So obviously you've got the ISP, you've got routers, you've got DNS, you've got all sorts of potential issues that may need troubleshooting. So again, the problem may not lie with the service or with the client, actually may lie with the broadband connection. So make sure that you have in place the ability to work through that and test that environment. So as I mentioned, the other thing apart from a business grade broadband connection is also to deploy a business grade router. Now, many customers have the cheap consumer routers, obviously for that reason that they're cheap. But what we find is as those devices are put under load, especially doing file transfers, doing lots and lots of emails, they simply don't have the resources, they don't have the memory, they don't have the buffers to be able to handle large amounts of information, typically coming from Office 365. So again, to get the best environment, make sure that you're looking at not only business grade broadband, preferably SDSL, but you're also looking to deploy business grade routers. So get away from those cheap $100 or under $100 routers and look to deploy a business grade router which will serve the needs and basically won't result in a bottleneck when you start obviously scaling up services and using things like file storage in Office 365. Now, when problems do occur, the very first thing that you should be looking at is the service health dashboard for the client. So again, you can go to the URL for that listed below. That will then ask you to log into Office 365. Once you've logged into that, you will see basically a board listing all of the services. Obviously, different icons in different locations indicate if there may be issues or if there's information. So you can click on any of those options there to get more information. So at the moment, the screenshot that I've got there, you'll see that email and calendar access currently is being investigated. If you clicked on that, that would then give you more information about that. So the first thing to do before you do go down and worry about too much troubleshooting is to go in and check the service health dashboard for the user who is reporting issues to make sure that the current status is clear. You'll notice in the top right hand corner there is an RSS feed, so you can subscribe to the health dashboard for the client or for the tenant using RSS, but remember, obviously it's protected and you need to have an RSS reader that would support the ability, obviously, to log in and pull that information for you. Now, apart from the health status, we've also got a message center. So Microsoft does push messages out to each tenant, and these are found in the message center. So, for example, as you can see, the majority of these are about being informational ones. So what's happening with Azure, what's happening with new features, things like that. You'll also find options about maybe upgrading the software or things that are going to be deprecated. You may also find information about planned maintenance, those sort of things. So again, the message center is there for Microsoft to communicate to the administrators of the tenant to make them aware of exactly what's going on and what is happening within the tenant. So certainly make sure that you check that as well regularly. Don't ignore the messages that do appear in the message center, because they certainly are important and are designed to let you know exactly what's going on in the Office 365 world. So as new features, for example, are rolled out to tenants, they happen, they basically appear in tenants at different times. That information is again communicated via the message center. So when you want to know when a new feature has been rolled out to a tenant, you will certainly find that in the message center. So again, second place that you really need to go and check on a regular basis. Okay, so the very first place, or the very first thing that seems to cause a lot of confusion, a lot of issues for people, is around managing the identity in Office 365. Now, typically the easy option obviously is to have the users log directly into Office 365. All the identity is in Office 365, but we're seeing more and more people deploy the synchronized model, where they take a copy of their Active Directory up into Office 365. And again, there's a lot of confusion about where the identity is and some of the basic features there. So with any Office 365 tenant that you have set up, and maybe you've taken over, or you're evaluating, or you're helping a customer to troubleshoot, first question to ask is, where is the identity mastered? Is it mastered in the cloud? Is it a synchronized model, which means that identity is mastered on the local domain controller and then copied up to Office 365? Or in the rare cases, is it a federated environment in which again is mastered all on premises with a local AD? So first thing to do is to go and identify where the identity is actually mastered. So where do you need to change to update users' login name, their passwords, all that sort of stuff. You need to identify where that is occurring. The second thing that seems to happen in a lot of cases is people fail to allocate users the correct licenses. So again, you remember that in some cases you may have users that have different licensing. So some of them may have a suite, some of them may have a kiosk plan, some of them may have a number of different options, and they may be assigned different licensing environments. So remember that not every customer that you see or every prospect that you work with will have exactly the same licensing, or may have a single suite covering everything. So again, when you get people who can't access services or something's unavailable, again, make sure that you go in and check that user to ensure that they have the correct licenses and they have been assigned. So make sure that the license is obviously valid. It hasn't expired. Again, remember that licenses typically need to be renewed on a 12-month scheme. And again, if they do expire, then you will get warnings. If those warnings are ignored, then obviously access to the services will no longer be available. So again, second thing I can give you here when it comes to identity is, as basic as it sounds, make sure that you go in and verify that the right users have the right licenses. And for example, users that have left the business have their licenses removed. Okay, if you are doing synchronized identity using a tool or using the software that's on the local network, is it actually working? Is the synchronization services running? Can you see that the logs actually show that it's working? When was the last time it updated? go in and do some basic troubleshooting to make sure it is working. Remember, the good thing about synchronized identity is if there's ever a problem with the machine on which the synchronization software runs, you can simply move that synchronization software to another machine. The preference is always generally to put it on a member server, but you can now do that on a domain control if you're using something like Azure AD Connect. So again, if there are issues and you do identify them, it may be easier simply to reinstall the synchronization tool on another server to overcome those issues. But make sure you go in and check that, excuse me, that synchronization is actually working, is actually synchronizing on a regular basis, because if a user property changes or their password, for example, changes, then that may not be synchronizing to the cloud and may be the cause of the issue. The recommended software to use to synchronize from your local Active Directory to Office 365 is now Azure AD Connect. There is, like I said, the original DirSync. There is the Azure AD Sync, the newer tool, and we have run over that in a previous webinar. But the preferred tool today, if you are doing installs, and I generally would be recommending upgrading to the better tool, which is Azure AD Connect. So if you certainly have DirSync out there, would be looking to replace that and upgrade that as soon as possible. Azure AD Sync, again, certainly we'll be scheduling to look at upgrading that and make sure everything's running the latest Azure AD Connect, a better tool, more robust, and again, supported on domain controllers now. As I mentioned previously, make sure that you check the synchronization logs. For example, what you can do, which we have shown, is that you can make a change, a simple change in the AD. So maybe you go in and change the location of a user's office, and then you force synchronization, and you'll be able to track through whether those changes are actually happening and see that replicated into Office 365. So again, there is a service tool there that allows you to go in and actually view the synchronization process, look at the logs, dive deep into what's happening with the synchronization. So if you do have identity problems and you are synchronizing to on-premises, make sure that you are checking the logs and the synchronization service is running. Again, not only should you be checking the synchronization logs, don't forget the event logs on that server which synchronization is running. You'll find a whole raft of information that is actually written to the Windows logs as well that you probably should be checking. And one of the other most common things I see is the password expiry. So by default, your user's passwords are going to expire in Office 365. That can prevent a user obviously logging in once that's expired or they miss the password change. So make sure that you're aware of what the expiry is. If you want to turn it off, you can certainly do that in the console. You can also do that with PowerShell so that you can loop through all the users quickly and easily. But again, one of the most painful things, or one time-consuming things, is that when a organization's passwords expire, they all expire at the same time. So there's a lot of phone calls that are made or service requests that are required to get that changed. So one of the things that you need to I would be suggesting that you do in your checklist when you do run up Office 365 is to confirm with the user what password expiry policy they want, whether they do want it to expire or whether they just wish it to be left at the user. It's up to the user to change their password if and when they need to. So once we've basically troubleshot identity, we've got the users in, we've given them licenses. The next most common issue that I see is around troubleshooting Exchange Online. So again, reinforce here that you should be looking at a business grade router. Typically where I see issues is when there's a migration done of emails from an on-premises server to Exchange Online. Obviously there's a huge amount of emails and a large amount of connections that are open when this is happening. If you have a consumer grade router, it simply doesn't have the buffers, simply doesn't have the memory, doesn't have the resources to manage such a large migration of emails in one hit. So again, even at the point of migration, I'll be recommending that you upgrade to a business grade router which has more than adequate resources to handle this large volume of traffic, especially when it comes to a migration. Another very common issue is people leaving the local Exchange server in place. So they leave it up and running even after they've migrated the server, and then thinking that if they can roll back if there are issues. So the Exchange server typically sits in the environment. You would have the local clients are probably still looking for the local Exchange server in preference to the one in Office 365. You get confusion around which Exchange server the clients should be connecting to. Again, so if you can, the recommendation is once you finish doing your cutover of Exchange, certainly make sure that you remove the Exchange server from your environment, and certainly would make sure that you at least shut it down and remove all references to it to avoid confusion when it comes to clients. So typically when you're moving from an on-premises environment that did have an Exchange server, be very aware that if that Exchange server is still running, it can still be in the mix, and clients can be looking to that as the default rather than looking to Office 365. And typically the way that happens is around group policy. So typically what you'll find with a local on-premises Exchange server is a group policy that continues to point the local clients to the on-premises Exchange server. So rather than going out to Office 365, they then again try and connect to the Exchange server. So even if you have shut down the Exchange server, the group policy again will continue to point back to the Exchange server on premises, which it won't find. It'll time out. You'll get password requests. You'll get all sorts of fun and games there. So again, not only make sure that you remove the local Exchange server, but also remove any references to it in something like group policy, which is again pushed out to the clients on premises. One of the great tools for doing all this sort of stuff, checking with your Exchange configuration, is testexchangeconnectivity.com. So that will not only test things like Exchange, that will now test Skype for Business, certainly test a whole range, a whole raft of options there. So again, when you have clients who typically, Outlook clients that can't connect to Exchange Online, first port of call generally is to power up testexchangeconnectivity.com, go in and do the tests and have a look at the extensive information that is provided, and that will give you testing on things like DNS and auto discover records and all those sort of stuff, and basically allow you to see where any issues may lie. So again, strongly recommend that testexchangeconnectivity.com is a major tool in your tool belt when you are troubleshooting not only Exchange but also things like Skype for Business. And another very common issue is not having the correct time, date, and time zone. So when you go into Office 365 when you set up a mailbox, the very first thing it asks you for is a time zone. Again, AD is very sensitive to time zone configuration. So again, make sure that they all match. You have them in the correct region, you have them in the correct time zone, and that they're all valid. So you can get situations where a client may have an incorrect time zone, or maybe looking at perhaps it was configured for the Pacific time zone in the US, and that throws it out and it won't be allowed to log in or connect to Office 365 services because the difference in time is too significant for things like Kerberos to be enforced. So again, beware that you need to make sure that the time, date, and time zone are valid and are correct across your network and across the clients. Now, if you still do have clients that are running Office 2010, Office 2010 requires a desktop client to be installed. Now, thanks to the release recently of Office 2016, that 2010 client has now been deprecated. You typically won't find that anymore inside the portal, so clients can't download that. If they already have it on their desktop, it's available in the Microsoft download site, no longer in the Office 365 portal. But if you have clients who do have 2010 who still want to use 2010, make sure that the desktop client software is installed. That desktop client will ensure that the 2010 versions are patched correctly and are configured correctly. Now, anything post 2010, so 2013 and 2016, do not require any additional desktop client software to be installed on the workstation. So again, going forward, that will be less of a requirement. But if you do have people with 2010, make sure that that desktop client gets installed on those workstations to ensure everything is configured correctly and set up appropriately for that older version of software. And it would seem obvious, but again, make sure that your client software is up to date. So the click to run install. So if you've done a click to run install from Office 365, you can certainly force an update to make sure things are correct, but it should be updating in the background automatically. If you have installed that via another means, maybe OEM or whatever, again, make sure that that software is kept up to date, that Windows updates are applied, Office updates are installed. That's generally going to be the first thing that the Microsoft support people are going to ask you when you log a service call. Is everything patched and up to date, including the Office desktop system? So again, another opportunity to go and talk to clients and talk to them about the importance of having sure they have the most current software. The reason is obviously that Office 365 is changing all the time, updating and improving, and generally needs to take advantage of the latest options that are available in all the clients. So make sure that all the client software and the operating systems are up to date. Now, if you aren't aware, if you go into the software options for your tenant, so you go in and have a look at the Office 365 settings and where you normally download Office, for example, you will find under Tools and Add-ins, there is now an Office 365 Support and Recovery Assistant. So again, this will allow you to download a piece of software, install it on the desktop, and that will step you through a number of tests and troubleshooting options that you can use to identify issues. So again, remember that Office 365 does include some basic troubleshooting and testing software, and again, in this case, this is found in the software area under the Tools and Add-ins and can be downloaded basically by any client who can access their Office 365 portal. Now, SharePoint is probably a little bit of a different kettle of fish because we're moving from an email environment where a lot of people are very familiar with. They've worked with emails, they've worked with the client. The SharePoint and the file system can be challenging in the fact that it is basically something that not many people are familiar with. So again, the first point of call is to remember that if we're talking about ADSL and we're using SharePoint and OneDrive quite heavily, that our uploads are going to be significantly throttled simply given the ADSL bandwidth. So again, set the expectation early that the customers understand that if they start uploading files of 2 to 3 meg, they're obviously going to take a lot longer to upload into SharePoint Online team sites or OneDrive for Business, and that is going to cause frustration again if they aren't aware, and may also cause issues. So again, bandwidth is a very important thing to appreciate here, obviously, as the demands on the environment increase. Now, OneDrive for Business Sync Client has had many issues. It was probably one of the weakest components of Office 365. At the moment, the important thing to remember is that there is a new preview client that is available. It's currently not in production. Microsoft have committed to have the new client available before the end of the year, so in the November timeframe. However, if you're using or your clients are using OneDrive for Business Sync today, they certainly will start noticing issues once they start trying to synchronize great volumes of information. So you need to be aware of the limits. So there are limits around how many files can be synchronized at a time. So OneDrive for Business, you can synchronize up to 20,000 files. In a SharePoint library, individual library, you can do 5,000 items. So if you have a client who has dragged and dropped their entire file server into OneDrive for Business and they've got millions and millions of files, trying to synchronize those back to every desktop is going to cause lots and lots of pain. That is being rectified, as I mentioned, with the new sync client, but at this point in time, make sure that you know the limits around OneDrive for Business. And my personal recommendation is you certainly want to discourage bulk synchronization of gigs and gigs and gigs of data from Office 365 back to the desktop. I don't think synchronization as a technology, no matter what you use, it certainly has a lot of issues. Like if it gets out of sync, it has security issues around keeping files on individual workstations. The Microsoft's OneDrive for Business Sync client, as it stands today, was designed to take a limited number of files offline to work when you're traveling or didn't have access to the internet. It wasn't designed basically as a Dropbox replacement. However, as I mentioned, the new sync client is available in preview. You can have a look, download it, and start using it today. And it Microsoft has committed to have that in production and available as an automatic upgrade for all users in the November timeframe. So the improvement to the sync client is coming, and hopefully that will remove a lot of limits and a lot of frustrations that people see. But I have in the resources section here, the links here, I have some links to sites that will hopefully help you troubleshoot any sync issues much better. When you upload files to SharePoint, you need to also appreciate that there are some limitations around file names and the type of files. This has significantly reduced over time, so there are less and less limitations now. There are only a handful of file types that aren't supported being taken up to SharePoint. Also be aware that some file names may cause issues. So typically these are files that have HTTP style characters in them, so question marks, hashes, those sort of things can prevent a file. So if you have something called profit ampersand loss, ampersand is generally going to cause you an issue and should be renamed to something else. Again, Microsoft have committed with the new sync client that you'll be able to identify these and rename those issues, those file types with issues on the fly. So that is certainly being changed. But at this point in time, you either need to rename them manually or use an automated tool to go and make sure that you don't have any files that may be prevented from uploading to both OneDrive and SharePoint. So again, beware of file name and type limitations. The other big issue generally around SharePoint is understanding permissions. So by default, SharePoint inherits permissions down through its structure. So a user at the top of the tree is automatically given rights all the way through the tree like a file system unless that is manually changed. So if you go in and start creating, or the user wants to create a complex structure that involves unique permissions, that can prove to be very hard to troubleshoot. So you need to appreciate that the best way obviously is to apply permissions as high as you can up the tree and avoid doing individual permissions, as with best practice with file systems is to basically assign permissions via groups rather than individual users. But if you inherit a site that has lots and lots of unique permissions, then it can be a fair amount of work to tidy that up and make sure that is correct. So again, SharePoint is very much like a file system. You are able to apply individual permissions right down to a file level. Not recommended, but some people obviously go in and do that. But one of the important things to understand is when you're working with SharePoint is to understand how the permissions work, how they're assigned, how they flow through the organization, how you can check to see why one user has access to something and another user doesn't. So again, spend some time learning and understanding how SharePoint permissions work and how they are assigned to individual users. Another issue that I see a lot of people having is maybe something like trying to view a SharePoint library with Windows Explorer, the file manager. It's important to realize that some of the functionality is only available using the Internet Explorer browser. So things like potentially opening up in Excel, exporting to Excel, or like I said, connecting to Windows Explorer File Manager to drag and drop files is generally only available in Internet Explorer. So we have a number of browsers out there, Chrome, Firefox as well. At this point in time, they don't support that ability. So if you open the ribbon in SharePoint and you see that the buttons are grayed out, typically that will mean that the user is not using Internet Explorer. So if they are having issues mapping a drive or connecting to Windows Explorer with SharePoint, make sure you ask them initially what browser they are using and if they can repeat the process using Internet Explorer. And again, there are plenty of browser plugins, add-ins that can cause issues. They can intercept calls. They can interfere with the way that SharePoint does work. So if you are getting issues with uploading files, with copying files, pasting files, doing those sort of things in SharePoint or opening Word Online, make sure you go in and check the browser add-ins, plugins you've got. Also recommend that you open in private browsing just to remove any of the memory or cookies and stuff that's running in the background there. So standard browser testing obviously applies, but watch out for those third-party plugins and add-ins that also may trip up things like SharePoint. Skype for Business. Typically, the main issue we see around Skype for Business are firewall issues, so make sure that the ports are open. Generally, they are. we have seen issues that when you initiate a Skype for Business meeting, it actually sends a small exe file through to commence the sharing process. Sometimes that exe file can get basically held up by the firewall. There are troubleshooting KB articles on that, but be aware that if you're having problems connecting or making or sharing desktops or sharing a whiteboard in Skype for Business, it typically has something to do with the content management aspect of a firewall. So the firewall is basically inspecting all the content and all the packets. It finds an exe file which it may think is not signed, and then it will prevent that from going to the client, and therefore they can't do things like share the desktop. So again, typically issues around connectivity with Skype for Business are related to the firewall. Dig into the firewall, have a look at the logs that are there, and see if there are any exceptions being thrown up. The other thing to do is, if you want to, you can obviously connect Skype for Business to a third party, so you can connect it to external users who have Skype for Business. You can also connect it to consumer Skype if you want, but that external sharing has to be enabled, and you do that in the admin area for Skype for Business. So if you have users who wish to connect to users outside their organization and they can't, and that's happening for all users, make sure you go in and check that the external sharing option has been enabled. Another point of advice is, when you go to get people to do Skype for Business meetings, make sure that they test their audio, they make sure their microphones are plugged in, they make sure their speakers work. There's nothing more frustrating or time consuming when you set up a Skype for Business meeting and you make it happen, all to find out that one user, they can't hear, they can't get their speakers to work, they haven't got a microphone. It all becomes very frustrating. So make sure that if you're going down the path of using something like Skype for Business to do meetings, that the audio, the headsets, the microphones, all of that stuff is set up and working. Generally, in many cases, one of the things I've seen some resellers do is actually buy a range of headsets for the customers to use Skype for Business. So again, they can just plug it into the USB, everything's managed, everything works quite well, quite easily, rather than leaving the client to scrabble around for a set of speakers and maybe a microphone. So again, spend some time testing the PC audio before you launch into doing Skype for Business meetings. And you may not appreciate, but there is an advanced connection settings in the Skype for Business client. So again, if you go into the tools and the options, you'll find that there is a connection settings option, and by default it's set up to connect automatically. But you can flick that over to a manual configuration and, for example, type in the direct server name and port number that you wish to connect to on Skype. So that may be perhaps you're getting a DNS issue, or it's not connecting directly. Typically where I see this most common is when we're talking about Mac machines. So if you have a Mac machine that currently still is Link 2013 client, sometimes the automatic settings for whatever reason don't seem to want to connect up to Office 365. So you need to go into the manual configuration and basically just type in the appropriate Skype for Business servers into the manual configuration, and generally that fixes the problem. So you can swap between the two at any point, but if you need to, you can always go in and set the manual configuration. But remember that Microsoft does occasionally change the servers for Skype for Business, so you may have to go and update those if you have set those to being manual. So some best practices here for you. Again, as with any technology, make sure that you've got a standard troubleshooting checklist to follow. You know, is the internet up? Can you do this? Can you get email? When was the last time this happened? Again, helps you to basically track down the issues much quicker. Check the Office 365 service health first, so make sure you go in and look to see that there aren't any issues around the Office 365 services. It's all very frustrating to spend a significant amount of time troubleshooting and find that maybe the email service or the calendar service is currently experiencing troubles in Office 365. So make sure you go in and check the service health first for the tenant. The other thing I would mention here is don't be afraid to log a support call immediately with Microsoft. So go into the tenant and basically log a support call. It doesn't cost you anything. If you're able to solve the problem before the client, before Microsoft can, great. If Microsoft is able to solve it before you can, that's also a benefit to the customer. So remember that free technical support is provided in all Office 365 plans, and I certainly would be encouraging you to log a support call as soon as it arises and continue obviously to work through your own methods, but you just never know. Having that ready and already logged, if you do hit a roadblock, then that can obviously continue on for you, make it much easier and quicker to solve a problem. Again, one of the things is that client calls up and says, they can't get access to the internet. The reality is it's probably something very simple. It may just be they can't get to their emails. Everything else is working. So again, one of the first most obvious steps that a lot of people seem to overlook is, again, is it localized? Is it the internet? Is it Office 365? Is it the client? Is it Outlook? If you can narrow that down quickly, then you're going to be able to find the problem and focus and spend your energies on what really is the problem. So unfortunately, like I said, most customers get frustrated very quickly and they'll just blame, they'll just say everything's not working. So again, you've worked through this with other technologies, but again, remember here that there are a lot of moving parts. There's the client's machine, there's client software, the connection to the internet, their local LAN, their router, their ISP, and then the Office 365 as well. So again, the sooner you can track down exactly what the problem is, remember, it may not just be an Office 365 issue, it could be a broadband issue. Again, as I mentioned, like I said, it could be issues other than Office 365, could be a broadband connection situation, could be their DNS issue, could be a failure of something on the client end. So don't necessarily blame the Office 365 service. Apply the standard troubleshooting logic to work through and find out exactly what the issue is. Again, the difficulty here is there's probably a lot of different providers in the loop. You've got your ISP, you've got Microsoft, you've got the client. So again, it can be frustrating, and a lot of that you can't necessarily access directly yourself. You have to rely on others. So again, that's why that checklist is good, that if you have a problem with your ISP, you know who to call, what to speak to, how to log a service call, and you can pass that on to all your staff. And if, for example, the Outlook version doesn't work on the desktop, does the web version work? So if they're mapped to drive in SharePoint and they can't copy files up to there, can they upload files manually using the web browser? So remember, a lot of this stuff can be accessed through the web browser. And again, let's see whether that's working. So if the shared mailbox isn't available in Outlook on the desktop, is the shared mailbox available in the web version? To see whether it is actually the Office 365 service or actually something on the local desktop. So our takeaways are, again, many links in this chain now. It's not always an Office 365 problem. It could be a performance issue on the broadband. It could be DNS issues. It could be, for example, somebody's resynchronizing their OneDrive for Business synchronization files and basically sucking all the broadband connections. So there are lots and lots of links in this chain that you'll probably need to have a look at. Again, a standard troubleshooting methodology and checklist. Go, look at the firewall, look at the logs, go to the health service, check the message center, where's the identity, check the sync logs, all that sort of stuff. You don't want to be fumbling around at the last minute. So again, good troubleshooting practice is all about developing a standard set of checklist for each site that you can then work through and has all the information and basically shortcuts the troubleshooting process. And there are plenty of tools from Microsoft that certainly do the troubleshooting. I've mentioned some already. There are some in the resources. Take advantage of those, and one of those tools obviously is the ability to log a free support call with Microsoft. So don't underestimate the ability to use that as well. Now, apart from all this, you can do everything in the web interface if you want, but don't forget that you can use PowerShell. So if clients have issues, you can certainly basically go in, run a PowerShell script and go out and do some standard tests. Can you get to a mailbox? Can you see the users? Can you view the Office 365 license settings? So again, running and setting up a standard procedure to check the environment using PowerShell potentially can save you the time of logging in, clicking on different things, moving through all the options. So again, PowerShell will give you that ability to quickly query a tenant and potentially locate the issue as it may happen quickly. So again, some resources here. The slides are available after the fact for you, so no need to copy these. This will be available from Dicker Data for you. See that I've got resources in there around OneDrive, Sync, Exchange, Azure AD Sync, Link, Skype for business audio, all that sort of information. So as always, appreciate if you could basically just let us know what where are we? What state that you basically your business is in, just so we know and we can target the information better. So appreciate you taking a moment just to complete the quick poll there, just to let us know how many of you are calling from each state. Much appreciated, obviously, you attending this and taking the time to let us know about your business quickly. Okay, so give that a minute or two. So what I'll do is, okay, so I think we're done with that. So let's swap back to the slides. Hopefully it'll jump back to the same position. Nope. All right, so let me jump to the end of the slides here. Okay, so again, thank you very much for attending the webinar. For those of you that do need to head off, please take note of the options here, microsoft.sales@dicadata.com.au. If you do need to get in contact with me, you can do that via the information there. Remember, next week we'll have a look at some creating a basic LAN in Azure, again, Wednesdays 11 to 11:45. Appreciate you taking the time to attend, and I'm going to stop